This is what I plan to cover in this hour together. So first, actual what defining what competency frameworks are, and then talking about the structure of those frameworks and the power of them, or otherwise known as the use of competency frameworks, and how to get started, either building or expanding competency frameworks that you may already have. Um, as you can see by the title, this is using them to fuel your training programs. I'm not specifying whether this is for customer partner training or internal employee training. A lot of you who know me know that I talk a lot, very heavily on the customer education side of things. Um, but I do actually work across both. So if you're joining from either angle, which we'll figure out in a poll in a second, this is relevant to you. So I will probably specify a bit more on how to adapt this for customer partner and product training, because I think that's the area where it's a little bit more of a gray box and people are using these more so for employee training. So anyway, regardless of which side you're on, I think you'll hopefully be able to get something out of this workshop. So you may already know me. If you don't, I am Vicky Kennedy. I'm the founder of Echtus. I do have a couple decades plus of experience in this world of education, both in strategic leadership roles and in product roles. I started out my career in higher education. For 10 years. I worked at a college and built out the curriculum for bachelor programs and the accreditation for that as well. So quite familiar with formal structure of education, which is where a lot of my formal work on curriculum development and competency frameworks came from. It was a kind of not really a trade school, but a bit of a specific kind of career school in higher education. So moved into the tech space in 2012, where I really took that into the world of tech. And since that time, I've worked directly for Amazon and Meta and some smaller companies, and also have consulted for some of the larger companies, as you can see there. And I launched Ectus 2 years ago. I can't believe it's been 2 years now, but I've been doing it 2 years, working with organizations to specifically help them use education strategically to get results. And interestingly, when I first launched the business, I did not expect competency frameworks to be like a primary thing. But it has been one of the things that we've done kind of quite consistently, as either just a direct service or part of other services that we're doing. So that's why, I wanted to do this workshop. I think there's just a lot of room for discussion around them and for use of them. And yeah, anyway, that's who I am. I'd love to learn a bit about who's on the call. Just let me do a quick poll here. See that. I think hopefully y'all can see the poll, but I just want to know who's on the call. Okay, good. Who's on the call from, as we talked about, the internal side or the external side, as it's often referred to, and where everyone is with competency framework. So I'll leave that up for a minute. All right. Wow. Um, okay. I don't know. I'm not as I haven't used a lot of polls myself, but if I end it, I think you all can see it. I don't know if you can see it in real time, the same as I can. But if you can see it or not see it, basically, no one on the call is using competency frameworks today, which is surprising. I actually thought it would be a bit mixed, but maybe not surprising. That's how you're doing, and hopefully we'll be able to change that. And then probably less surprising to me is that most of you working on the customer product partner side of the business, and we have a couple on the HR internal side as well. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing that. And oh, I can share the results. Look at that. Oh, so now you can see pretty consistent here. All right, so let's dive into the actual reason that you're on the call. So I wanted to start off by defining what we mean by competency frameworks, because um, if you think about like any kind of framework, often you see a specific template, and that's what a framework looks like. So if you're using any kind of, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but a specific named framework, you go there, you have a template, and that's like how you use it. So is that the same thing with competency frameworks? Do we see the same kind of consistent framework over and over again? So let's look at what it actually is. When we say competency framework, it's a model that describes the roles in an organization and the list of competence and skills required to perform those roles. So, pretty straightforward. Basically, it is a representation of a competent employee or a competent, job role, and it looks holistically at all the competencies that are required for that person to be successful in that job role. And if you Google competency frameworks, you often see them in this kind of visual format. This is one that is for a CFO, and you see that the inner ring there is the domains, and we'll talk about what these actually are in a few slides. But the domains of foundation, implementation, and impact, and then that outer ring is the actual competencies. So these are visuals that you see often, and they look like that. This is another one for a product designer role from the Peak Product Designer. So again, you see like the inner ring of domains. In this case, we have customer insight, product strategy, and then that outer ring of the competencies. So under customer insight, you see competencies specific to fluency with data, voice of the customer, and user experience design. So this is, again, pretty common. It's not like one specific framework that you see, but you often do see the rings of the domains and the competencies around that. And sometimes you do get to a layer of skills around that as well. And here, let me not see that. Here is another one that we see for domains of clinical research professional. Now, this one's a bit interesting too, because this is for a clinical research professional, which is not as specific as like a product designer or product manager or CFO. It's a bit broader, where it may be a different kind of roles that fit into that. But you do often see competency frameworks that are used to kind of capture the essence of a role. And that's very relevant for those of you on the customer and partner side of the business, because you don't necessarily have one very specific clean role that you are targeting. There may be like types of roles. And so in this case, you can see the framework is for those in clinical research professional roles. And this is just 8 domains that it's showing in this one. But you get the idea that there's these visuals that you see. But you'll also see competency models and matrices like this. So this is still a competency framework, but this is now moving into more the implementation, the use of that framework. In this case, you see the domains and the competencies on the side there. So we have positioning and messaging, we have user journey, marketing channels, and then you see basically the proficiency statements across different levels. So this is actually now taking these kinds of designs into the more application stage, where we're specifically stating what is proficiency across these different domains. And then we use them oftentimes in this case here, you use it to actually level someone on their performance or see how they're tracking. And they're also used, of course, for growth and promotion and things like that. So this is another sort of visual example of where you'll see a competency framework. And this as well, I was checking my chat. Okay. This is another one where we're seeing the domains across, in this case, technical expertise, self-management, etc. And then we're seeing specific proficiency statements within those competency domains. And this is for specifically for mid-level software developers. So when we say what is a competency framework, what do we actually mean by that? We mean I mean at the sort of broadest level, the actual structure of the domains and competencies and skills, and then the way that we're using that in these different matrices. So when I develop these for clients, I'm presenting them with the actual spreadsheet of all of the structure itself, which we'll show you a little bit later, and then also these proficiency statements that allow you to actually do something, either building the training content to support that or using them on the performance side. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all kind of template, but they're typical types of things that we're looking at with a competency framework. So then moving into the actual structure of that framework and what we see within that, we have essentially, they're all in this general structure. We have the domain, and then the domain is made up of competencies, and the competencies are made up of knowledge, skill, and ability, also known as KSA or KSA statements. So the domain is the broad area of competence. So that's the broadest sort of topic category of competencies you can think of it, but it's the broad area. And then the competency itself is basically the actualization of the knowledge, skills, and abilities. So it's the combination of knowledge, skill, and ability that contribute to that performance. So it's more of the measurable sort of manifestation of the knowledge, skill, and ability. So I look at it as basically the domain is the broader area. The competency is kind of one level down. You have multiple competencies that come together to say that someone's proficient in that broader domain. And then to be proficient in that competency, you need to have a certain measure of knowledge, skill, and ability. So knowledge, knowledge topics, as you might guess, that's the information that you develop. So specific around the knowledge. The skill is the actual act of using that knowledge. So in this case, we see it as a result of applying knowledge or ability, and ability is the innate potential to perform. I often just kind of keep it to knowledge and skill, especially when I'm working in the product and customer education space. But you'll see them as KSA statements, yeah, typically. But they're the more granular elements that make up competency. So that's essentially what you see. So when we talk about a competency framework, we're talking about these things as they go together. It's not simply a list of competencies. It's really specifically how competency is demonstrated and the different skills and knowledge topics that you need to reach that competency. And then also having distinct competencies within the domain. So we'll talk about what that distinction looks like in a bit. But the sort of unique aspect of it is the structure of how all this comes together in a way that can be used repeatedly and across multiple roles. So as an example, this is just, very high level kind of example of a framework for an admin role, just like an office administration role. So what we see here at the very top is three domains, or are three domains: communication, office skills, and time management. So three distinct domains. And what I mean by that is you can be proficient in communication without being proficient in office skills, and vice versa. You can be proficient in time management, but not communication. So those are distinct domain areas. And then within the domain of office skills, we may have three sort of competency areas around spreadsheets, around word processing, around file management. Again, those are three distinct competency areas. You need to be proficient in all three of those competency areas to say you're proficient in office skills. So you see how that connects together. The middle one there says word processing, and then we have what's called the competency statement. So we're saying to be competent in word processing is can produce documents for relevant business purpose. So there's a little bit of a typo there. I couldn't fix it because there's a snapshot, but you get the idea. So it can produce documents for relevant business purposes. So that's essentially our measurable statement. And then what are the knowledge and skill topics that we need to be proficient in word processing? While typing and formatting are two examples. So again, very like high level kind of example just to show you how all that comes together. But again, what's unique here is that these are connected in a way, but also distinct, so that we can say that you can be proficient in spreadsheets without being proficient in word processing, and vice versa, or similarly with file management. So this is looking at the sort of holistic competency of an admin role, and this is very relevant for the one or two of you on the call that are focusing on employee side and the admin side. So you have all the distinct employee roles at an organization, and of course you want to look at the holistic, framework and the holistic competencies that admin role would need to be proficient in their job. But for those of you who are focusing on the other side, the customer employee side. This is going to look like a digression, and I promise it's not. I'm going to bring it back. But I want to talk about this difference between employee and customer partner. From my perspective, what I see a lot of the external side, as we call it, when you're treating product, customer, partner, that sort of end of the business, we're not using competency frameworks as much in that side because we're not talking about employee training. And I think that there is a big sort of connotation that competency frameworks are specific to employee training, but they have a very distinct use, of course, across both, or I wouldn't be doing this workshop. So first, when we talk about the two internal and external sides of the business of training, when we say internal, what we really mean is that that's usually somebody on the HR team or L&D team who's focused on the way that the organization takes in learning. So that's why you have a chief learning officer. They're responsible for how the whole organization learns and how that learning leads to growth and talent development. And so their responsibility is for the holistic learning of all the roles across the organization, and usually have like someone focused on leadership and maybe some technical learning. But that's really what we mean by the internal. It's not so much internal, external learner. It's the internal aspect of learning across the team. When you're working on the other side of the business, the customer, partner, product training, if you are on a team that is teaching proprietary solutions outward, that's kind of the external focus, right? Now we're educating outward, and we are responsible for how we educate our proprietary solutions outward across all audiences, which may include employees. And so when we think about competency frameworks for for basically all of our external audiences, there's no way that we can be responsible for the learning at other organizations, right? But we can be responsible for the dissemination of that education. So that's an important distinction that I wanted to make before moving into the next slide, because even though we are not responsible necessarily for all of the competencies at our, end learner, whether it's a partner or a B2B organization, we are responsible for what we can control, which is the proprietary content. And so now if we look at that same competency framework, I'm going to back up a second just to remind you of this one. So we have the admin role looking at the three domains of competency. And now if we're looking at just the domain of office skills, let's say that we work at Microsoft Office and we're really just responsible for the products and solutions that are specific for office skills. Now we're just kind of focused on that level and that domain itself, but now we can have like a different layer of granularity. So instead of the three high-level domains there, we now have domains around file management, word processing, and spreadsheets, and we go down a layer into the competency here around formatting. So you see it's actually just different layers of granularity that we're getting into, where here we may get more specific since we're in charge of the product. We may get more specific around like the headings and the tables specific to the formatting. So that just kind of shows an example of where you can really start to like understand what you are responsible for. If you're doing the product, customer, partner side of training, you aren't necessarily developing training on communication and time management. However, you may need to see that kind of holistic view of the typical types of personas that are interacting with your products and solutions so that you know what is actually necessary and relevant for them to get value out of your products and solutions. So for example, if time management was a core value or a core, I should say, core competency that someone needed to actually get results out of your solution, then you do need to understand that and learn that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to train on that, but you should have that as part of the overall kind of bird's eye view of what you're looking at as far as training. So this just hopefully helps take out the mindset of product feature specific and really thinking about the competencies that are involved so that you can look at the different the different roles. So so that's just kind of a little bit there on the difference of sort of the internal versus external. And just thinking really about like the granularity, because that's a question that I've gotten asked before. Like, how granular do you go? You can always kind of break things down into more and more and more and more. Where do you start? Where do you go with it? And the answer to that is it depends. It's a great answer, but it depends on a couple of things. Again, here, if we are looking at the higher level of the whole admin role, then we really probably aren't going to get down into the super duper weeds of like, well, what does it mean to be proficient in typing? But if we are really focused on this level, then we may get into, well, what are the specific kind of skills and knowledge that you need to be good at formatting? Well, we need to know about headings and we need to know how to use tables. And so that's where you can really understand the level of granularity that your competency framework should have. All right. Checking in on my chat and stuff. Okay. And just a reminder, if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to drop them in there and I will do my best to get them, or at least get them at some point. Okay, moving on. So the power of competency frameworks. Now that we know what they are generally and how they're structured, how do you use them? And that's really the essence of what I wanted to cover in this workshop. So of course, they are used for talent development. That's the main thing that we're probably all familiar with them for. They are typically living in the HR team when it comes to the sort of employee side of training. So in this example, you see this heat map showing different departments on the left and the different competency domains down here. So we can get a sense of like, okay, so our HR team is I'm going to assume the red is good because it says 3 to 4. Our HR team is doing really well with communication skills, and let's say the accounting team is not doing so well with communication skills. So we get a sense of like, where how we can uh, develop design training maps there. But for those of you on the other side, product customer partner side, the same type of thing could actually be used for different target segments that you're training. So you might have customer partner segments, you may have different sub segments, prospect segments. Ideally, you have a clear understanding of the different personas and different types of roles that you are training. And so you could also do this if you're a B2B organization, you may have like high level clients, a list of top organizations that work with you. And you can use that kind of similar map for that to get a sense of like how everyone's tracking. But that's one use. I think that's not a crazy use that everyone, probably has a lot of familiarity with. Um, the the more I think I wouldn't say more important, but the less the less talked about use of them is for developing scalable and modular curriculum as one thing. So this is a really big thing, and this is I mentioned at the beginning that we started to organically offer competency frameworks as part of our offering at Ectus because it was something we were doing anyway that was like core to the structure of building curriculum. I personally don't even know how I would go about building curriculum without building the competency framework first. So in this example, what we're looking at is on the left side, we have a high level, obviously, example of an onboarded customer and some competency areas that onboarded customer would need to be proficient in. In this example, let's say it's an ad tech platform. I've worked a lot with ad tech. So it's an ad tech platform, and we know that they need to be proficient in campaign management, and that involves skill and knowledge in pacing and budgeting. We also know they need to be proficient in reporting, and that involves skill in metrics and interpretation. Now, on the other side here, we have an onboarded partner. So, an onboarded partner needs to be proficient in the sale of your product, understanding the value prop and integrations, and coincidentally, reporting, metrics, and interpretation. So, you see the overlap here, obviously. This is where, when we can look at competency frameworks, we want to, even if you are only responsible for one specific persona, role, whatever, or one area of your product, you really ideally want to think big in the development of your framework so that you can get a sense of what other roles may eventually click into that. So you're not developing something in a silo. And I know that's always a challenge on the customer education side of the world is the silo, but this is an opportunity to work as cross collaboratively and functionally as possible to develop stuff that will scale across multiple roles, even if you're not targeting those roles today. And so in this example, we see that we have two different personas or two different segments that both need to be um, proficient in reporting. And so we don't need to duplicate the wheel there as we develop training. We know that we can develop this sort of training module that may span across different audiences. We can get custom at certain points. Like you may have like a certain lesson here and there that's a little bit differently tailored for partners versus customers. But for the most part, this gives you a sense of, okay, well, both of these roles need to be proficient in reporting. You also can see, for example, sales up here, you're going to have internal sales teams that also need to know value prop and integrations. And so that's where you can even start to see the overlap with the proprietary content competencies and internal and external learners. And so that's the scalable aspect of this, is that we can build these competency frameworks out. We want to be thinking ahead about all of the different types of roles and personas that may be applicable here, and we want to build for those roles so that we can kind of plug that in. And so the main piece of advice I can give you there is just to try not to think too specifically about one or two roles, but to get as big as you can, even if you're not targeting those other ones right now. The other aspect of this is a modular curriculum. So when you're working with a competency framework, you can ideally see how all the skills, knowledge and skill topics ladder up into different competencies, and if those competencies ladder up into a proficient customer or partner or employee. And so you may have, for example, somebody that needs to know about budgeting and pacing to be proficient here. Maybe they already know budgeting. So you don't have to have everything kind of crunched together in one learning experience. You can have a more modular experience of lessons that connect together so that people can either opt in or out or assess in or out and be able to take what's relevant to them in that moment. This is also what you could use for adaptive learning and personalization so that if, again, somebody already comes in and they already know everything they need to know about pacing, but they need to know about budgeting, they can opt into that as well. And so you are thinking about basically the different components and structure of content so that it ladders up into the proficiency that you need. Um, and that just really just again helps with scalability across different audiences and across different products. And we'll talk about how this ties into tools and AI tools later in the webinar. But this is a big one, really, is scalable and modular curriculum. And in the same vein, is using this for LMS management. So once you have your competency framework all mapped out, what you would do is use this to actually tag and target different pieces of content in your LMS. So you have this potential, either a visualization or spreadsheet, and then you would have lessons or other types of content targeting pacing, targeting budgeting, and you'll be able to like connect all this and use this as a blueprint in your LMS management. So any type of system you're using is going to have some kind of taxonomy or tagging ability, and this could give you a really good framework for that. So that's a big plus for using these in the product side. Of course, they're also used directly for certification. So if you are building a product certification, um, you want to do this based off of a competency framework. So this is an example of AWS. And you can see here that they have the domain of cloud concepts. They have a competency of defining the benefits of the AWS cloud. So I would call that an AWS cloud competency. And then they have knowledge and skill statements. So you need to have knowledge of AWS cloud and skill in these things here. And so that is the structure of your certification. So if I'm certifying someone here, this becomes the actual blueprint of my certification exam. So anytime you see a higher stakes, like true credible certification, you will see this kind of breakout. So they're not even like beneficial. They're basically mandatory for doing a true valid certification to turning that into a blueprint. So you'll see that there. And this also, again, will kind of help force you to think about the role itself and the outcomes of that role rather than coming from the product side. It's something that I see frequently for people that are moving into a product training role or a customer education role, is just sort of defaulting to the mindset of the internal, like, here's what they need people to know about the product. And it's really beneficial to take a step back and think about the role itself as if you were managing those employees, and it just changes the way that you think about how you're measuring the actual competency and the use of your product and solution. Alrighty. So another big use of them is in measurable curriculum. So this is a big one. This is one of my big topics here, and I know this is a little bit hard to read, but it's just a snapshot of one of the diagrams that I've built for this. And so when you have a competency framework, it will essentially organically provide you with a measurement framework to start showing ROI and to start showing the actual impact of your training. And what I mean by that is on this far right side, you see KSA, the knowledge, skill, and ability statements. And so when you have, let's say, a customer who reaches a certain level of proficiency with that KSA, then they've reached that outcome. So you're training them to reach a certain outcome of KSAs. And that can be measured through some engagement. Ideally, you have some formative or summative assessment attached to your training. But once they reach that outcome of those more granular KSAs, then you're kind of putting together the outcomes that they've reached to measure the proficiency in the competency. And that, remember, is more of a measurable statement of their ability to do their job. And so here, this is just, again, kind of like it's levels of granularity. So we have very specific skill and knowledge topics that we're training them in. We're bringing that together to now make sure that they can actually put all that together to do something that they need to do with your solutions in their job. And so that you can measure through a proficiency score. If you have a certification, that's great because you can just tie that right into that. If you don't, there are other ways, which are a little bit out of the scope of this workshop, but there are other ways where you can measure proficiency that's not so like exam obvious. But essentially, you want to capture some metric there that's like, hey, they are proficient in this. And remember, going back to this example, we could say like, okay, they are proficient in campaign management, and we're able to measure that through XYZ. Or they are proficient in reporting. Here we taught them about metrics and interpretation. We kind of brought that together into a learning experience, and now we can say that they're proficient in reporting. So once we know that they're proficient in all the areas that we've outlined, then we can check that, okay, is their behavior changing? So now we've made them, I'll go back to this, we've made them proficient in reporting and campaign management and whatever else. And because of that, we want to see that they have utilized X number of seats, or that they've launched certain parts of the product, or that they've built certain things. I mean, this is completely dependent on whatever your solutions are. But that's the behavior metric that we anticipate would the behavior change that we anticipate would happen when they reach that competency, right? So that's the whole thing we're trying to do, is drive competency so that your end learner changes behavior. And again, whether that's an employee, partner, customer, doesn't matter who you're training. Ultimately, all training and education should be about long-term behavior change. And then that, if you're on the customer side, you want to connect that into a business problem or opportunity that you're addressing with this, and that's your success metric there. So if you are building an onboarding program for your customers, and you have a certain, we'll go back to that, we have a certain level of competency that we expect an onboarded customer to achieve in campaign management, reporting, whatever the other competencies are, then we have essentially, this is the opportunity we're looking for, is for them to reach that aha moment within 90 days, we'll say. And that would be your success metric that you're connecting that to, whether that's a health score or some other score in your CRM. But that's essentially the ultimate opportunity we're looking to drive there. And so the competency framework becomes the structure of your measurement framework, and allows you to see specifically what you're targeting, who you're targeting, and how that is actually tying up into the business. Alrighty. No questions yet in the chat, so I'm going to assume that I'm covering everything. But if I'm not, please throw those questions in there. Okay, I think, yeah, I'm going to whiteboard here at some point. So, all right, having said all that, in the beginning of the poll, it looked like no one on the call has competency frameworks today. So how do you begin with them? Overall, the steps to build competency frameworks at a high level, first thing is defining the purpose. So we talked about different uses of competency frameworks. I'm a big fan of, not being redundant and being efficient, so I wouldn't develop multiple frameworks. If you have something you're developing for a certification, for example, that would also be what you're using for your curriculum, your training curriculum, and your LMS and your measurement. So ideally, you're looking at that big picture, but you do want to have clarity on, like, okay, what are we building here, and why are we building it, and what is going to be the ultimate use of that? So that's defining the purpose. The next piece is gathering information, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in the weeds in another slide. But of course, we are not just doing this in a bubble. We need to really understand the roles of these competency frameworks. So along with the purpose, we kind of want to understand the roles. So if you're doing this for employee training, that's all kind of mapped out for you. You know the roles in your company. When you're doing this on the customer side or partner side, we have a lot less visibility into what those end roles may be. But that's where, if you remember one of those earlier slides, I talked about like the clinical research professional. That's where we can get a little bit kind of creative with how we define roles. So if you have a product, for example, that is specifically targeting project management, you may have like a project manager role, you may have like a marketing role. This is part of your persona work to really understand the different types of people and the roles that they have at organizations. So you don't have to get super specific as to like, well, my solution is for network security professionals, and this is what their role looks like at this organization, and this is what their role looks like at this organization. There's no way you can do that. That's that difference between learning and education. But what you can do is start to understand, okay, the general network security analyst looks like this, and generally these are the competencies that they need to do they need to be proficient in to do their job. And so that's where you can start to identify the role that you have to play in making sure they can be competent using your tools. So that's part of gathering information, is really understanding the roles that are relevant for the solutions that you're owning. and to really understand the workflows, how they are using your tools and solutions. So it's not from our internal side of how the product works as much it's from the external side of how are they using it in their workflow and what other skills do they need to be proficient in. I like to quote HubSpot for this because I think they do a good example of their academy really focusing on competencies that are not so specific to their products. So I know they have like SEO marketing, for example, and they're teaching SEO marketing skills. And that is a really great example here where it's like not how to use HubSpot, but it's SEO marketing skills and then connecting the use of HubSpot within that. And so that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about here when we build this competency framework is competence in SEO marketing. What does that look like? And then how do you connect your product and solution into that? And then constructing the framework is the part that's easier said than done, but it's essentially taking all that and now we're bringing that into a form and structure that will make sense as we expand it across roles and as we may expand the products and solutions. So I'll work on that in a second in a whiteboard, but that's the construction itself, and then of course implementing it um, for the purpose that you designed it for, and revising that over time. Remember that it's a living, breathing thing. With competency frameworks, they can go stale pretty quickly, so you want to revisit it, revise it, ideally yearly or even more commonly, depending on how fast the job role changes. So that's the overall steps to building that. And to dive more into the gather information part, I already kind of covered a little bit of this, just talking about that end user audience segment, and I guess I kind of expounded on this, but this is where you want to really think about how the end user is using all of your products and services. So another kind of, I'll say, rookie mistake that I see on the customer education side is to get too specific around products and not the workflow or the actual use of these products. So let's say that you work in an organization that has 5 different products out there, and you are only responsible for doing the training on one product. That may be an internal structure thing, but you have end users who may be using product A, B, and C together to achieve their results. And so that's something that you really want to think about is how are they using multiple products and solutions at your organization to achieve their results? So it shifts it from the product focus to the competency focus, essentially. And part of what you want to do is a job task analysis, understanding those roles, the jobs to be done. What does the proficient user do with your solutions, or again, if you're on the employee side, what does the proficient employee need to know to be able to do their job? So it's a job task analysis. You do this through interviews. You can do it through, and if you're doing the customer side, it doesn't mean you have to interview 1,000 customers. You could do some stuff that's survey based. You can interview internally your CSMs and product team to understand the ways that they're using your product and solution. And then you start to drop the competencies. So that's just basically gathering the information. The other thing to think about is that you can start from either end of this. So I am someone that tends to start with the bigger, like I tend to start broadly and kind of think about the different buckets of competency first and sort of bend that into not bend, but like merge that into the actual specific competencies that come out. You may be someone that likes to get into the weeds first and kind of list out all the different tasks that need to be done. And either way is fine. You could also do both and kind of combine it. So looking at it from either end is totally possible. And I am a very visual person, so I like to do it through mapping software, as you can see, like something like this, where I can actually start to see the connections. I do it sometimes through a spreadsheet as well, where I can just kind of see the connections. And if you have an actual whiteboard, that's even the most fun for me personally, is like whiteboarding it out. But I will say that the first draft of a competency framework looks nothing like the final draft. It is a work in progress as you like kind of list things out and see how things connect or don't connect to each other. You may have something in mind in the beginning, and as you're adding more to it, you realize like, oh, that structure doesn't actually work. It starts to break down. And remember, one of the main things about this is to make sure things are distinct, that you can be proficient in one competency without that being dependent on the proficiency of another competency. And that's probably the biggest kind of learning curve and trick with building these out is to really think about the distinct ways that skill and knowledge ladder up and competency kind of ladders up to be proficient. So I think this is where I wanted to do well, I'll just go through this slide and then I'll do a quick little whiteboarding exercise. So writing the actual competency, this, by the way, is just the high level like topic names, right? So this doesn't really help us with the actual statements. This is just telling us like campaign management. Okay, well, what does that mean? So we actually have to write the statements themselves, like the competency statement and the KSA statements. And so writing competencies, you can start with descriptions. In this example, knows oh wow, that's a typo. knows agile methodology and their applications, uses data to tell compelling stories, collaborates with design teams. These are just kind of like descriptions of competency. And then we identify similarities and differences between competencies. So this is basically where we can see whether competencies make sense together or whether they should be distinct. So, for example, good people skills does not necessarily lead to good leadership skills. So, putting them together wouldn't necessarily make sense, right? So, that's why we have to think about, well, do these depend on each other or can they be distinct from each other? As far as writing competencies and statements goes, there's this great resource from the U.S. government of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, believe it or not. I'm going to drop that in the chat if you want it. But it's a great little resource on tips for writing competency. It tells you, like, I'm not going to read through all this, but like obviously defining them simply and clearly. It has a correct and incorrect answer. This one I think is really important. Make sure it's in a single, readily identifiable characteristic. So in this example, incorrect, writes and speaks in a clear, concise, organized, convincing manner. Well, now we have writes and speaks, and those are not necessarily, they don't depend on each other, right? So we need to separate that out. Writes in a clear manner, speaks in a clear manner, two different things. So the other thing here, which we'll talk about, I guess I'm getting a little tight on time, but we'll talk about it in a minute. Avoiding making it too specific. Here's an example. Incorrect. Knowledge of Java and C++ is a very specific tool-based approach, whereas we could say knowledge of computer languages. So we're really talking more about the, the word result of using the tools and not the tool itself. Anyway, I won't go through the rest of this, but this is a great resource that you may want to reference. So I'm going to do a quick whiteboard. I think I have time. Do I have time? What slide am I on? Yeah. Um, one would find the whiteboard that was here a minute ago. Okay. Literally did this like, where's my whiteboard? Oh, for God's sakes. Okay, maybe we're not whiteboarding. Oh man, maybe somebody's gonna help me out. Under more, but yeah, that's where I was looking. It's not there. Literally like did this earlier and there is no whiteboard option today. That is very sad. Okay, well, you know what? I am gonna think on my feet and just not do the whiteboard. So we're going to just talk through it. That's so frustrating though. Literally like just went through this as one does to prep, but you know, it's because I'm sharing. I'm gonna give that just for funsies. Bear with me for a second. Ah, haha. There we go. It was because I was sharing. Okay. So I wanted to do an example of this just so you can kind of see my process. And I'm doing this for, kind of a funny, it's not funny, but it's probably not super relevant to anyone on the call. But let's say that I'm doing a competency framework for a house painter, somebody that is a self-employed house painter. What do they need to know to be a successful and proficient house painter? So one of the first domain areas we may see is that they need to know business acumen because they do need to run their business, right? They need to understand like all the basic things of running a self-employed business. They need to know marketing because they have to market their business. One might say that that could be part of business acumen, but for the sake of this demo, we'll keep it separate. I hate the arrows on Zoom's thing here. And of course, they need to know the functional competencies around painting itself. That's pretty important. So we'll put that there. Sorry, this isn't that pretty, but you get the idea. And then they also need to know customer experience, right? Being able to actually work with customers. So we see these sort of like high level domains that we could start with. And then we would really want to dive into, well, what does that actually look like for the house painter. What are the specific things they need to know to be successful running their business? Maybe business structure, taxes, that kind of thing. Marketing, they need to probably know some SEO, some social media marketing, be able to get their business out there. On the functional painting part, let's just use this one as an example. That's what somebody has added to my board. I know it's supposed to be collaborative whiteboarding, but I'm just using it. You're welcome to collaborate if you want. So let's say for functional house painting, they need to know paint types, right? There's all different types of paint. At the high level, there's oil and latex and all different things like that. They may need to know cleanup, right? The cleanup process, what's involved in that. They also need to know the preparation, but this is kind of the idea here. So this is what I mean when I like to say to start from more of the broad end and then get more into what these tasks look like. Now, my next layer here, as I start to identify what's involved, sorry, fun times there. Let's try that. As I start to identify what's involved in preparation for painting, I may find that there's actually a lot of overlap between cleanup and preparation, and that becomes one area, so that's why it's like you kind of work from both ends together, and you don't have to get stuck in your first draft because you're really developing this as you go. Now, what's interesting about this is, so we have, I wish this was a little bit prettier, but hopefully you're following me. So we have the functional painting as a competency here. We have business acumen, marketing, and customer experience. Now, if I also am doing this for a carpenter, right, a self-employed carpenter, they actually need to know pretty much the same competencies on business acumen and marketing, and probably customer experience as well. So you see that there's a lot of overlap with our carpenter. The main thing is functional. Obviously, a carpenter's functional competencies are going to be quite different than a painter, but you also may even start seeing some overlap there with like cleanup and prep process. You never know. So you kind of start thinking about, that's why I'm saying think about the other roles that are relevant to you there. I think for those who are adding, that's fun. But you get the idea there, right? So now, even more interestingly, is if I was expanding this to not a self-employed painter, but a painter that works as for a corporation, a painter that's just part of a larger corporation. They don't need to know marketing business because they're not doing that side, but they may need to know the leadership, right? So we have like a whole nother competency domain. This got messy real fast. But maybe we have another one that's like team management or team leadership, right? Because maybe they're like the lead painter and they have like juniors working under them. So I wanted to use the painting as an example because I think it's easy. Everyone kind of can follow that, and you get a sense of like how you see overlapping competency. But my process really is like this sort of whiteboarding approach where I start kind of high level and get a sense of, well, what are the general topic areas that people need to know? And then getting into the weeds with that and sort of moving things around. This is why I like the visual, moving things around as I'm learning more about the specific tasks that are involved there. So that's my whiteboarding session, and I'll let you all continue having fun with that. Whoever's building that out, I appreciate that. Um, I'm going to stop sharing. Well, actually, I think you all get this anyway, but I'll share it out. Um, it's kind of messy, but let's hop back to the last few slides that we have here. Um, so in the last few minutes, I wanted to just cover, of course, once we're doing this, once you have that all fleshed out, what do you do with it? My process is getting feedback and gaining alignment often throughout the process. It's not very helpful to spend all of that work doing it and then start showing that to stakeholders and you get a ton of other feedback. So usually I'll do that in stages where I might first get alignment on the competencies themselves, the high level competencies, just like the actual names themselves, get some feedback there, get some alignment, and then start fleshing out what the actual description of that competency is, and then proficiency statements. So in this example, this is actually on my website for the customer education competencies, but this is 3 different levels of customer education roles. And this is the specific like proficiency statement that is evidence of them being proficient in each competency. And so getting feedback throughout that process before you're doing the whole thing is obviously, I think, probably just good advice for any of these processes, but usually the high level, just kind of keeping it to the words only, and then getting into the weeds of the actual statements. So Last slide is really like the question of AI and other tools typically always comes up for me when I'm building these out for clients. And so a question you may have as well is AI its own separate competency? Is it a separate skill or even a separate domain? And my take on this from the experience I've had with working across different industries is that we're seeing, of course, AI is more and more a method and a process and a tool being used to achieve certain competency. So not a separate competency, but if, for example, we're thinking about marketing, a lot of people are using AI as part of their marketing process. So how does that actually show up in the different competency areas of marketing? Like, are you using AI to speed up different processes? But it becomes embedded in the skills and knowledge areas and not its own separate knowledge area. And if you think about like AI courses that are out there, there's not really like a necessarily like an AI course. It's usually like AI for marketing or AI for product design. And so that's where we're thinking about like not separating that out, but thinking about how you integrate that into the proficiency statement, for example. Like maybe we want our customer, partner, client, employee to be proficient in using AI to achieve a certain skill or competency. And the same with any tool and any very specific thing. That's kind of going back to the examples that I shared here, is that we're not trying to get all these specific tools and features. We're trying to get the actual evidence of use. You could have a whole separate spreadsheet that kind of ties your feature list into how they connect to those competencies, but you're not just teaching like product X or tool X or feature X. You're teaching how to use those to achieve the competency. So really try to focus away from the specifics of AI and tools as actual, like in this example here, as the actual competency itself. They may show up more in the statements of proficiency. You know, we want to see that they can use X tool to achieve data storytelling, or that they can use, you know, AI to do business modeling. So that's how I would think about that. I always feel like I'm going to have so much time at the end, and I don't. So I have 3 minutes left, and in those 3 minutes, I will just say, if you're building this out and you want help, this is what we do. So feel free to reach out anytime, even if you want to just bounce off some ideas of where you are. These are my contacts, and if you let me just check the chat if you had any questions. So I will share this recording. It's probably going to be in our on the YouTube, but reach out anytime if you have questions on this or anything else you're working on. I do thank you for your time. I know it's if you're on the East Coast, it's lunch hour, and I appreciate you giving that to me. And I think a few of you are on other time zones as well. So I appreciate the hour. It means a lot to me that you trust me with your time. And I thank you all. Take care.